So we verified the conditions and we made our hypotheses, so now it's time to fully test this researcher's claim. And I'm sorry to say we don't have a ton of space to work with down here, so please write small. Okay, so if we're going to test the claim, we could redo step 1. It's kind of unclear, but I'll just kind of write it again. So we know that P is 0.24 and the alternative is less than 0.24. Fine. Let's think here. I think I'll put step 2 right here. Alpha is 0.01. It's right there. I mean, it's given. So alpha is easy. You just have to look for it because it's always in the problem somewhere. Step 3 is the worst part for students because it requires you to go back to the formula sheet and write down this formula. And you don't need the middle one. I mean, you could use the middle one if you had the standard error, but you don't have the standard error. So we'll use this one instead. So it's p hat minus p0 over big square root P0 times Q0 over N. Okay, sure, wonderful. All right, now I need the values for these things. Now I know P0. P0 is from the null hypothesis. It's 0.24. So I can put 0.24. I know that this is 0.76. I already found it up above. And then I know this is 1068. The only thing I don't know is P hat. Oh, but I do. Because P hat is right here. It's the new value. So the new value is P hat. Okay. So P hat is 0.18. Right. So that's what's going to go right here. The newer value for the percentage. Now, this is where we want to take a moment. We do not want to go typing this into Desmos. I mean, why bother? Because StatCrunch will find it for us anyway, and we need StatCrunch to do step 4. So we want to take a pause, and we want to get this result. I'm going to do it in a different color or something, just to kind of flag this. Get the result from StatCrunch. Speaking of which, let's take a moment because we need to do some work here. The thing about StatCrunch, and we know the StatCrunch path, so we want to go stat, proportion stat, one sample, I'll put it over here, one sample with summary. I know that because it says so on the previous page where the instructions are, so I'm not making it up. I mean, I am, but right? It says so right here. Stat, proportion stat, one sample with summary. It's right there. Okay, now here's the thing. In order to get this to work, I'm going to need to have X. Let me show you what I mean. So if I go to StatCrunch and I say stat, proportion stat, one sample with summary, it says, okay, sure, what's your number of successes? That's X. But I don't have X. I know my number of observations. That's 1068. That's my sample size, right? But I need my number of successes to get this to work. So we're going to have to go find it. All right, so we need to make a note, an important note. We need X. Actually, you know what? I'm going to put it over here. That leaves me some space in there. All right, we need X for StatCrunch or the TI calculator, as a matter of fact. You need it no matter what you're doing. So you need X. Now, how do I find X? Well, I know that P hat is X over N. And I just know that P hat is 0.18. We just said so. And that's X over 1068 because that's my N, my sample size. So if I multiply by 1068 over here, but you got to do it to the right, whichever you do to the left, and vice versa. So I'm going to go grab Desmos and say, hey, Desmos, tell me what 0.18 times 1068 is. And it tells me that it's 192.24. Okay, so I'll write that down. But then I have to round it to the nearest whole number. Round. There we go. That's my number of successes. right there. And the number of observations is n. You might as well write this down because it gets a little confusing sometimes in StatCrunch what they're asking for. So number of observations is n, number of successes is x. All right, make a big note of all of that. You're going to need it because you're going to do it a lot. We've actually already run into this in chapter 9, and there it is again. So now let's use that. So let's go back to StatCrunch and say, okay, my number of successes is 192. My number of observations is 1068. Now I'm going to have to choose the correct hypotheses. So for one thing, my null hypothesis is that it's 0.24. So I'm going to make sure that I fix that to 0.24. And then I change my direction to match my alternative hypothesis. Now StatCrunch calls it HA. Some books do. Some textbooks do. Some textbooks use 1. Tomato, tomato, right? So it's fine. So it's the alternative. And then make that a less than, and then be sure down here to click the little box for the p-value plot because that will be your step 4. And then say compute. So you can see over here, there's your ZStat and there's your p-value. And if you want, you can click the little arrow and there's step 4 already done for you. That's the graph that you need for step 4. And it's so small a p-value, it's so far over that there's basically no tail to shade, but that's okay. We're going to exaggerate a little bit for our purposes. Okay, so let's do a step 4 right here. And we've got a z-score. Our z0 is, oh, and I forgot to put it up here. It was negative 4.608. Negative 4.608. That number becomes that number down here. If it's on the left, it'll be negative. If it's on the right, it'll be positive. So this is negative. That tail has a p-value. The area in that tail is the p-value. And it's so small that StatCrunch doesn't even bother finding it. StatCrunch just tells us, hey, it's less than 0.0001. Really, really small is what it's telling us, right? So this number and this number are always the same. So whatever you find in step 3, that's the number you put down here. I'm drawing the picture just like we see here. See how the z0 is there? We're doing a left-tailed test, right? So there's my p-value. The problem is that my p-value is just not this big. I have a really teeny tiny tail, so I've just put it further over. There we go. Step 1, hypotheses. Step 2, alpha. Step 3, that's where all the work is, right? Because then you got to get your x and fill this out, right? And you'll have to do x a lot. Not all problems, but a lot of problems you'll have to find x. Then once you have that, step 4 is done by StatCrunch. You just have to kind of copy it down and be sure to label it properly. The z's go on the bottom, p-values on the top. Once we know that, now it's time for step 5, which is our decision. Now, if you look at your decision step, it says if your p-value is less than alpha, reject the null hypothesis. In other words, if your p-value is low, reject HO, which our p-value is so small that StatCrunch isn't bothering to tell us what it is. So we're definitely going to reject HO, right? Our p-value, which is less than 0.0001, whatever it is less than our alpha, which was 0.01, right? So alpha is right here, 0.01, and we are less than that. So we are rejecting H0. All right, so now when we reject H0, that means that there is sufficient evidence Normally I give you more space than this. I don't know why I crammed this one, but no, sufficient evidence to support the claim that. Right? And now we just have to figure out the claim. So if we go back up, the claim is always the alternative. It's that the percentage of adult Americans that pay for their weekly purchases with cash has decreased, right? So it's a little awkward. So we'll just say that the percent of adult Americans that pay for purchases with cash purchases. Losing my brain. With cash is lower than 24%. Right, that'll work. All right, so we've done all 6 steps, right? Null and alternative hypothesis right here. We have our alpha right there. We have our Z0 all labeled out with our formula and substitution and result. We get that result from StatCrunch, and we get step 4 from StatCrunch. Get from StatCrunch. StatCrunch draws the picture for you, so use it. Then we have to make a decision. Remember, you're always looking for statistical significance, which means when your p-value is low, you get to reject your HO. That's what you want. And there is sufficient evidence to support the claim that the percent, and then we fill that out. That's step 6. All right, I'm actually going to show how to do this with a TI-84. So if you're not watching or not using a TI-84, you can just skip ahead to the next video. All right, TI-84 folks. So when you go to Stat, you want to move to the Tests menu. So when you hit your right arrow, right, twice, or your left arrow once if you're at the edit menu, that'll work. And you're looking for a 1 proportion z-test, which is the 5th one down there. So 1 prop z-test. So you hit that. Now you type in your p0, which is 0.24. You still, just like they do in StatCrunch, need x. So you have to type 192, which you'd have to go calculate, and 1068. And then you have to choose the less than option. So you want your p to be less than p0. And then you go down to calculate and press enter. And there you have it. The draw is not so useful for you. So in case you're wondering, why didn't I choose draw? I could. Here, let me show you. That's what it looks like. It's not really drawing much of anything because this is off screen. So unlike StatCrunch, which gave you a little bit of a window as to where it was, the calculator doesn't. The calculator just goes from -3 to 3 no matter what. And so it's kind of not that useful. But that's what the draw feature is. So stat tests, number 5, put in all your values and go to calculate. And your p-value, it actually is giving you the p-value. It's telling you it's 0.000002, right? So very, very small.